I'm part of a volunteer search and rescue group, and every year, we hold a late summer retreat filled with team building and training exercises. One of the key activities is nighttime practice, where we simulate search and rescue missions in the dark. My role in the group is as a K-9 handler, which ties directly to why I joined in the first place. I've always loved working with animals, but I didn't have the grades to pursue veterinary school. Becoming a dog handler allowed me to do something meaningful while spending time with dogs, though spending time is probably an understatement, given how demanding the job can be. On one of these night training exercises, my dog, who is trained to detect human remains, picked up a scent. I was paired with a senior team member at the time, and when I looked to her for advice, she simply said, "Let's follow it." You might wonder why I wasn't immediately alarmed that my dog was signaling something so serious. The truth is, even highly trained cadaver dogs sometimes make mistakes. In damp areas like the forests of Oregon where we were, the environment can throw off their accuracy. Our standard procedure is to let the dog do its job and investigate the source of the scent. At best, it's a false alarm. At worst, we discover human remains, which, while unsettling, is part of what we're trained to handle. The senior team member and I agreed to temporarily split up. She stayed on the trail while I followed the dog into the woods, thinking it would only take a few minutes before my dog lost the trail and we'd rejoin the group. But minutes turned into more minutes, and soon my dog led me down a steep slope. I lost my footing and tumbled, landing hard on the rocky ground. Pain shot through my chest. It felt like something was on fire, and when I touched my head, my hand came away bloody. I later learned I'd cracked 2 ribs and cut my scalp. The first thing I did was hit the emergency alert on my GPS, which would notify base camp that I needed help. The second thing I did was call out for my dog, Max. I dropped his leash during the fall, and he'd either run off scared or kept following the scent, thinking I was right behind him. I was in rough shape, bleeding, disoriented, and in agonizing pain. I'd also lost my flashlight in the fall, so I was surrounded by darkness. I lay there, calling for Max and hoping that someone from base camp was on their way. I don't know how long I was lying there before I heard footsteps approaching. Relief washed over me as I called out, "I'm here. I think I'm hurt bad." But as soon as I heard the voice that responded, my relief turned to dread. The voice didn't belong to anyone from our team. I knew this because we spend a lot of time bonding during the retreat, and I was familiar with every volunteer's voice. This was a man's voice, and it was completely unfamiliar. Instead of offering help, the man started talking about the area I'd fallen into. He said it was a dry creek bed where people often got injured, and at least one person drowned there every year during flash floods. His tone wasn't comforting or concerned. It was cold and almost amused, like he enjoyed talking about these tragedies. I went from asking for help to begging for it, but he ignored me. Instead, he kept describing how dangerous the area was, as if he were giving some kind of eerie lecture. When I got frustrated and snapped at him, asking why he wasn't helping me, he replied, "You're not in a position to talk to me like that." A chill ran down my spine. I started screaming for help, even though the effort sent stabbing pain through my chest. Then I heard Max. He's an Australian Shepherd mix, and he's a very vocal dog. His howls and barks were unmistakable, and they sounded like he was trying to guide me to him, or the other way around. As soon as Max's noises got louder, the man went silent. I heard his footsteps retreating as Max's got closer. A minute or two later, more footsteps approached, this time accompanied by flashlights. I called out again, and 2 of my teammates found me. As soon as they saw me, I told them about the strange man who had been there. One of them immediately shone his flashlight around, while the other asked if I'd been pushed. They were clearly worried that the man might have caused my fall. I assured them that the fall was an accident, but I couldn't explain why the man had been there or why he acted so strangely. He hadn't helped me, but it seemed like he'd been watching from somewhere nearby. The team stayed with me until a medic arrived with an ATV to get me back to camp. From there, I was taken to a small clinic, where the doctors confirmed my broken ribs and treated my head wound. Once I was stable, my teammates relaxed a little, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the woods. The next morning, I told everyone about him. His warnings about the creek bed didn't feel like concern. They felt like threats. A week later, after I'd been discharged from the hospital, I got a call from the senior team member I'd been partnered with. She asked how I was doing, then mentioned that other volunteers had reported seeing a man wandering the woods that night. After discussing it, the team decided to move next year's retreat to a different location. In the words of one of our leaders, "We're not taking chances with that guy showing up again." Patapsco Valley State Park used to be one of my favorite spots in the world. I grew up just outside of Baltimore, in a place called Woodridge. Some of you might recognize the name, though probably not for good reasons. I went to Woodridge High School, the same one attended by Adnan S. and Heyman L., whose tragic story was made famous by the Serial podcast. For those who don't know, Serial was one of the first big true crime podcasts, focusing on the case of Adnan's alleged murder of his girlfriend, Heyman. The podcast cast a long shadow over Woodridge and made Baltimore's already poor reputation even worse. I used to love both my hometown and the nearby areas, spending way too much time defending them online. But one day, everything changed. So much so that I swore I'd never set foot in Patapsco Valley State Park again. It was the summer of 2014, and my girlfriend at the time and I decided to go camping. Patapsco had plenty of great camping spots, each with its own picnic table and fire pit. I'd grown up hiking and camping there, so I knew the park like the back of my hand. I especially loved a hidden stretch of trail running between the river and some train tracks. It was secluded, peaceful, and felt like something out of a fairy tale, so I thought it'd be the perfect spot to impress my girlfriend. After finding an empty campsite and setting everything up, we crossed the train tracks and headed toward the river. About 10 or 15 minutes into the hike, my girlfriend was captivated by the scenery, taking dozens of pictures on her phone. Suddenly, we heard voices on the other side of the river. The river isn't very wide, but the thick summer foliage blocked our view. That is, until someone suddenly burst out of the bushes and sprinted into the water. The person looked terrified, and as they ran, they tripped over something, a rock, maybe, and fell hard into the river. I was about to run toward them to see if they needed help, but before I could move, the person scrambled to their feet, turned around and shouted, "No, please, no." Then we heard 3 gunshots, bang, bang, bang. The person collapsed backward into the river. It happened so quickly, voices, a fall, then gunshots, and suddenly someone was dead. Before the body had even fully hit the water, my girlfriend and I turned and ran as fast as we could. In an instant, my excitement for the day turned into sheer panic. We weren't being shot at, but the thought of someone willing to do such a thing made it clear they wouldn't want witnesses either. As we ran, I couldn't help but slow myself down slightly to shield my girlfriend. It wasn't some heroic move. It was pure instinct. I just kept thinking, if someone's going to get shot, let it be me, not her. That thought haunted me the entire way back. I hoped desperately that if a bullet did hit me, it wouldn't pass through and hurt her too. My girlfriend was incredible. She ran like her life depended on it, stayed completely silent, and didn't slow down until we were safely across the tracks. Those minutes were the most terrifying of my life. If I'd been alone, or maybe with a buddy, it still would have been horrifying. But having my girlfriend with me made it so much worse. There's something about knowing you can't fully protect the person you care about in a life or death situation that sticks with you. Thankfully, we got out of there safely. Once we were far enough away, we called the police and reported everything. But as far as I know, the person who was shot hasn't been identified, and the killer was never caught. I haven't been back to Patapsco since, and I doubt I ever will. The memories of that day are still too fresh, and the thought of how close we came to danger keeps me up some nights. My name is Mark, and I'm a longtime fan from Brisbane, Australia. The story I want to share involves you and your YouTube channel in a bit of a roundabout way. I met my girlfriend in March 2018, and she was the one who introduced me to your videos. At first, I thought it was kind of odd that she used scary stories to help her fall asleep, but after a while, I got into it. We even made a habit of listening to your stories while doing the dishes after dinner. It became a little ritual for us. One evening in February 2020, we were listening to one of your camping story compilations when my girlfriend suggested we visit the Garaga Valley. Garaga Valley is about a 4-hour drive from Brisbane and is a popular spot for hiking and camping. I know it probably sounds a bit crazy to listen to creepy camping tales and then decide to camp ourselves, but we weren't too worried. Rural crime is rare, and we didn't feel like we'd be in any real danger. Looking back now, though, what happened next was grimly ironic. We drove out to Garaga on March 14, 2020. After buying some camping gear online, we set off to find a nice spot to pitch our tent. On the way, we noticed a couple standing just off the trail. About 10 or 15 meters away from them, there was a burned-out Outtro and what looked like the charred remains of a tent. The couple, a man and a woman, both looking to be in their late 20s, seemed concerned. The man was pacing back and forth with his phone to his ear, looking visibly distressed. At first, I assumed they'd somehow set their campsite on fire and accidentally torched their Outtro along with it. We weren't too focused on figuring out what had happened, though. We just wanted to make sure they were okay. As we walked closer, the man finished his phone call and turned to greet us. He explained that the burned-out site wasn't theirs. They had just stumbled upon it, like we had. He had called the police to report it, as it was obvious the fire was recent. The smell of burned wood and plastic was still strong in the air. What stood out, though, was that the man said there was untouched food at the campsite, newly bought items, which made him think this wasn't just some kids destroying property for fun. The couple had done the right thing by calling the authorities, so after checking they were okay, my girlfriend and I continued on our way. We didn't think anything sinister was going on at the time. It seemed like a tragic accident, and there were no signs of foul play, no blood, no visible injuries, nothing alarming. A couple of days after we returned home, my girlfriend sent me a link to a local news article. The burned-out Outtro and tent we'd seen belonged to an elderly couple who had gone camping in the valley. However, they had never returned home and were now listed as missing. Police were appealing for information, so my girlfriend and I got in touch. Unfortunately, we weren't much help. We'd been in the valley for 2 nights but hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious other than the burned campsite. For a while, we wondered if the couple we'd met near the site could have been involved somehow. After all, we had no way to verify that they'd called the police. But when we mentioned them to the authorities, they assured us they'd already interviewed the person who made the report. We were just being paranoid. The couple we met had nothing to do with the elderly couple's disappearance. We only found out for sure about 18 months later, when the missing couple's bodies were discovered. It was devastating but not surprising. We assumed they'd been injured in a fire and had gotten lost or succumbed to the elements. My girlfriend speculated that they might have inhaled toxic smoke or suffered burns that led to infections. It seemed like a tragic accident. But then the truth came out. It wasn't an accident at all. The elderly couple had been murdered. Their Outtro and tent had been burned to destroy evidence. Learning that we'd unknowingly walked past a murder scene was chilling. Even more unsettling was the timing. The murders had happened less than 24 hours before we arrived. If we'd gotten there a day earlier, we might have seen the elderly couple alive or even crossed paths with their killer. For a while, my girlfriend and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was it random? Could we have been in danger too? As it turned out, the murder wasn't random at all. The killer didn't know the victims beforehand, but the whole incident stemmed from an argument over a drone. The case is still making its way through the courts, but from what we've read, the killer claimed the elderly man pointed a gun at him. The killer allegedly rushed him, grabbed the gun, and killed both the man and his wife before setting fire to their belongings to cover his tracks. It's horrifying to think someone could kill over something as trivial as a drone. The killer's lawyers have tried to portray him as remorseful, citing his claims that he vomited from the smell of the fire and felt terrible about what he'd done. Personally, I find it hard to feel any sympathy for him. Anyway, thanks for letting me share this story. Best of luck with your channel, and I hope this guy gets the long sentence he deserves. It's shocking what some people are capable of over something so insignificant. The arguments always began the same way. You'll never catch me stepping foot in one of those national parks filled with nothing but RV driving tourists. He liked to call himself old-fashioned, though that term barely scratched the surface. If it wasn't made from canvas or leather, he dismissed it as flimsy modern junk. My mom tried more than once to convince him to use things like nylon tents, but he wasn't having any of it. He insisted on lugging that heavy, musty wall tent everywhere we camped. And don't get me started on the kerosene cans that leaked all over our gear. He seemed like a man born in the wrong century. The phrase "roughing it" must have been invented just for him. We endured his outdated camping habits until my younger brother's brush with death forced him to rethink his ways. In the late 80s, my dad had a tradition of taking us camping in the national forests every Thanksgiving. The weather was usually mild, and the forests were breathtakingly beautiful. I can still smell the pine trees. For reasons I didn't understand at the time, our trips always overlapped with hunting season. Dad had apparently hunted before marrying Mom, but she put an end to it. I think these trips were his way of pushing back a little. Gunshots near camp became so normal that no one thought twice about them. My brother Sam and I were left to roam the woods unsupervised. Back then, no one worried about the risks of two kids wandering around with hunters nearby. It was just the way things were. We'd leave camp at dawn, explore until lunch, then head back out until dinner. One particular Thanksgiving, Sam and I had been crawling and running through the underbrush all day. We were obsessed with G.I. Joe and action movies at the time, and playing war in our camo clothes was our favorite pastime. Sam had just turned 9 and gotten a pair of cheap walkie-talkies for his birthday. They weren't great, but we thought they were the coolest thing ever. After lunch, we went back to the woods. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but Sam was sneaking around, trying to ambush me. I was sitting on a fallen log when a loud bang shattered the quiet, followed by a sharp whistle near my head. I froze, dropping to the ground instinctively. Seconds later, I heard a faint moan in the distance. I called for Sam on the walkie-talkie, but there was no response. Panic started to set in. I called again, louder this time, but still got no answer. Instead, I thought I heard my name faintly in the wind. I yelled out, telling Sam the game was over and that he needed to answer me. Silence. Then, I heard rustling nearby, followed by another faint moan. My heart raced as I ran toward the sound. After about 20 yards, I stopped and crouched low, scanning the ground. That's when I saw the bottom of a sneaker sticking out from under some bushes. It was Sam's shoe. I rushed over, and the sight still haunts me. Sam was lying there, pale and terrified, with blood soaking the ground beneath him. He'd been shot just below his arm. I wanted to cry, but I knew I had to stay calm. I lifted him in my arms and started running back toward camp. He was too heavy for me, but I didn't stop until I absolutely had to. I set him down and he whispered weakly, telling me to get help. Fighting back tears, I sprinted the rest of the way to camp. Mom must have sensed something was wrong because she yelled for Dad as soon as she saw me. He ran out, took one look at me and asked, "How bad is it?" Too out of breath to speak, I just pointed toward the woods. He took off immediately. By the time I caught up, Dad had already found Sam and was carrying him back to camp. The drive to the hospital, which should have taken 30 minutes, took us less than 20. I sat in the back seat, pressing my shirt against Sam's wound while Mom kept talking to him, begging him to hold on. The doctors rushed him into surgery as soon as we arrived. Those hours were a blur. The surgery was touch and go, and I later learned that Sam's heart had stopped more than once. But by midnight, the doctors gave us cautious good news. Sam would recover fully. The police showed up to investigate, questioning us about the shooting. It was the first time I truly grasped that I could have been the one hit. The prevailing theory was that a poacher mistook Sam for a deer and fired blindly. Sam spent weeks in the hospital. We stayed in a nearby motel, and for the first time, Dad gave up on camping for the season. He never said it outright, but the whole ordeal changed him. Over the years, we never returned to that forest. Instead, we started camping in safer, more family-friendly parks. Places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon became our go-to spots, and those holidays were some of the most peaceful times I can remember. Now, decades later, Sam is fully recovered and has a family of his own. We never found out who fired the shot that day, but in the end, something good came of it. We learned the value of safety and how to truly enjoy the great outdoors. I never thought I'd go camping with my coworkers from the bank, but when someone suggested it during a meeting, everyone seemed excited. A weekend away from computers and emails sounded like a nice change. So, we packed our stuff and drove to a campsite about 2 hours out of town. The place was far from everything, just tall trees all around and a river running nearby. We set up our tents in a small open space not far from the water. The first day was great. We cooked over the fire, joked about work, and looked at the stars. Felt good to just relax. But by the second night, something about the place started to feel wrong. It began with a noise. Around midnight, as we sat around the fire, I heard what sounded like sticks breaking in the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the noise didn't stop. It got closer, slow and steady, like footsteps. I glanced at the others, and I could tell they heard it too, even though no one said anything. I tried to ignore it, telling myself the woods can be noisy at night. But then something caught my eye. The firelight reflected off something small on the ground, just outside our campsite. I walked over to check it out. When I picked it up, I froze. It was a phone, dirty and cracked. The screen was smashed, but the back had a name scratched into it. I didn't recognize the name, but the phone looked like it hadn't been there long. It wasn't covered in dust or leaves like you'd expect if it had been lying there for days. I showed it to the others, and everyone agreed it was weird. We hadn't seen anyone else in the area since we arrived, and it didn't make sense for someone to lose a phone out here. As the fire burned lower, people started going to their tents. I stayed up for a while, listening to the forest, but eventually, I couldn't keep my eyes open, so I went to bed too. I woke up a few hours later to a loud noise, something heavy hitting the ground. Then came fast footsteps moving around outside. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. The campsite was a mess. 2 of the tents had been cut open, and everyone's stuff was scattered all over. The others were out of their tents, looking around with wide eyes. No one could figure out what had happened. Then someone pointed to the edge of the clearing. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh and deep. They were bigger than any of ours and led straight back into the woods. We didn't stick around to find out who made them. We packed up in a rush, stuffing our things into our bags without folding or sorting. By the time the sun started coming up, we were already driving back to the city. I kept thinking about that phone. Who did it belong to? Why was it out there? And why did someone or something slash our tents and watch us from the woods? I couldn't let it go, so I looked up missing person reports near that campsite, but I didn't find anything. The whole thing didn't make sense. A few weeks later, I saw something on the news about another group camping in the same area. They'd gone missing. The search teams found their gear ripped apart, but no sign of the people. That's when I realized we had been lucky. We got out in time, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there that night had been watching us the whole time, waiting. I haven't been camping since, and I never will again. Some places aren't empty. Some places are waiting for you to let your guard down. I needed a quiet place to focus on my research about health problems people might face in forests. Camping out deep in the woods seemed like the best idea. No noise, no people, just nature and my work. I picked a spot that was far from any road, far from anyone. I thought the peace and quiet would be perfect. I set up my tent in a small open space surrounded by thick trees. The first day went well. I took notes, collected samples, and studied how the plants grew in this area. By evening, I had a small fire going, and everything felt calm. It was the kind of calm that clears your head and makes you think better. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up to the sounds of owls hooting or small animals moving in the bushes. It didn't bother me, though. That's just how the forest is, I thought. The second night felt different. As I lay in my tent, the usual forest sounds seemed quieter. It was like everything had stopped to listen. Around midnight, I heard a faint crunching sound, like someone walking, but it stopped as soon as I sat up. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning, I found something weird near my camp. A small pile of rocks had been neatly stacked at the edge of the clearing. I didn't put them there. At first, I thought it was just something natural, maybe the wind or water, but the rocks were too carefully stacked. I tried not to think too much about it and got back to my work, though the feeling of unease stayed with me. That night, the noises came again. This time, they were closer. Slow, steady footsteps circled my tent. I froze and held my breath. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful. When they stopped, I grabbed my flashlight and opened the tent just enough to look outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, lit by the pale moonlight. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife tightly. By morning, I'd had enough. Whatever was out here wasn't something I wanted to mess with. I decided to pack up and leave. But when I stepped out of my tent, I stopped in my tracks. More piles of rocks were around my tent, arranged in strange patterns. My chest tightened. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest, which had felt so peaceful before, now felt alive in a way I didn't like. It was like the trees themselves were watching me. I headed back toward the trail I'd marked with bright orange tape tied to branches. But the tape was gone. The trail I'd followed just a few days ago had vanished. Panic set in. I pulled out my compass, but it wouldn't work. The needle spun wildly, refusing to point north. I wandered for hours trying to find something familiar, but the trees all looked the same. The more I walked, the heavier my pack felt, like the weight of the forest itself was pressing down on me. By the time the sun set, I was still lost. I stopped and built a fire, sitting with my back against a tree to keep anything from sneaking up behind me. The footsteps came again. This time, they stayed just outside the firelight, circling me slowly. I couldn't see anything beyond the flames, but I felt it. Something was there. My hands shook as I held my knife, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped just before dawn, but I didn't sleep. As soon as it was light enough to see, I started moving again, hoping to find a way out. Finally, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me as I dropped to my knees. But before I could take another step, I felt it, the weight of someone watching me. I turned back to look at the forest. There, in the shadows of the trees, stood a figure. It was too far to see clearly, but it wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I ran as fast as I could down the road, not daring to look back again. It wasn't until I reached my car hours later that I stopped to catch my breath. But even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't leave it behind. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the same slow footsteps outside my window. The rain started slow, soft drops tapping on the top of my tent. It had been a quiet evening. Just me, my gear, and the calm of the woods. I'd picked a spot close to a river, thinking the sound of the water would help me sleep. First, it did. The rain added to the peacefulness, making it feel even cozier inside my little tent. But as the rain got heavier, the calm started to fade. The light tapping turned into loud drumming, and I could hear it pouring all around me. I checked the edges of the tent, making sure no water was leaking in, then pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me. The air felt damp, and the ground beneath me seemed softer, like it was starting to give way under the weight of the water. I thought it was just the rain soaking into the dirt. Then I felt something cold on my arm. A thin stream of water was running into the tent and pooling in one corner. The small trench I dug earlier to keep water away clearly wasn't working. I grabbed a towel from my bag and started soaking up the water, trying to stay calm. If my sleeping bag got wet, I'd be in trouble. As I worked, I heard a sound outside. At first, I told myself it was the rain hitting branches or maybe wind pushing through the trees. But it didn't sound like that. It sounded like someone or something moving. I stopped, holding my breath. The noise stopped too. It wasn't far, just outside the light of my tent. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But when I heard it again, it sounded heavier, like boots pressing into wet mud. My chest tightened. I stayed completely still, gripping the towel like it could protect me. The steps were slow, circling the tent. I could hear the squishing of the mud under each step. I reached for my knife, the only thing I had to defend myself. My flashlight was already in my hand, but I didn't dare turn it on. If I did, whoever was out there would know exactly where I was. I sat frozen, listening to the sound of the steps. They moved around the tent in a wide circle, deliberate, like they were studying me. Then the footsteps stopped, right near where my head was. For a moment, everything was silent except for the rain. And then I heard it breathing, deep, steady breaths, just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever it was might hear it. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there holding the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. My mind raced with what I should do. Should I yell? Make a run for it? Stay still and hope they went away? Every choice felt wrong. The breathing stopped suddenly, and I thought for a second they had left. Then I heard the steps again, slow and heavy, moving away into the rain. They didn't rush, didn't stumble, just walked off like they weren't in any hurry. I stayed frozen long after the sound had faded. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I couldn't sleep. I stayed curled up in my sleeping bag, clutching the knife, listening to the rain. When morning came, the forest was quiet, like nothing had happened. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out, half expecting to see something or someone, waiting for me. Instead, all I found were muddy footprints. They were everywhere, circling my tent over and over. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. What really got me, though, was where the prints ended. They didn't lead to the trail or the river. They just stopped about 20 feet away, right in the middle of the woods, like whoever it was had simply vanished. As I packed up my gear, I kept looking around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. My hands were shaking so badly it took me twice as long to get everything packed. I left as fast as I could, not stopping once to rest. I haven't been back to that spot since. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, about how they circled my tent over and over while I was inside, about how they ended in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can hear the sound of slow, heavy steps outside my window.